So the 47 in theory are for this session.
Mhm. Well,
All right,
thanks again
take
for
it away.
folks. Thanks again for folks coming to our first session about the Global Open Research Commons, where we're going to be talking about model adoption and next steps. This is a combined session between the interest group and the working group that we're doing together because we've been kind of working hand in hand over the last, I don't even know, 2-3 years. No, I haven't been a part of it for that long, but I know that the groups have been intermingled for a long time, and they're under the same GORC umbrella. So first of all, the session is being recorded, as you likely saw or heard when you joined Zoom, but just a heads up on that. I think because we have such a small group, we're happy to do like hands raised in Zoom and then unmuting and asking questions and engaging in discussion that way. We don't necessarily need to rely on the chat too much, but you're also welcome to enter questions via the chat. But again, small group, so we're open to doing things just by audio as well. And welcome to folks for the new RDA members. It's great. If you are a new RDA member, thank you for coming to our session in particular. That is a great first jump into RDA, I think. And we're hoping to, exemplify all the things that RDA stands for in our groups for sure. So if you haven't already, go check out the collaborative notes. They are in the chat, and add your name. If you're comfortable adding your email address and where you're calling in from and what affiliation you have, that's also great. But it'd be just to know how many people attended the session. So even just your name would be great in those collaborative notes, but as much detail as you're comfortable adding. This is session 1. Session 2 will be next week. Okay, so I've done the welcome. Sorry, Andrew. But I'll let you do the icebreakers. And so what we're going to do today is we'll switch back and forth between Andrew and I. Another one of our co-chairs, Javier, is not able to attend this particular session. So it's just going to be the Andrew and CJ show, and Rory eventually later on. But we'll talk a little bit about the outputs that the interest group and the working group have done, and we're going to be using most of the time to talk about adoption. Most of our adopters are not present today, again, due to time zone difficulties. So we're going to be actually shifting that 50-minute slot mostly into the discussion on what comes next. That's the plan. So I'll turn it over to Andrew for welcome and icebreakers.
Okay, thank you, CJ. Distressed that CJ referred to it as just the Andrew and CJ show, but I'll come to terms with that. In Hoover, so in the Hoover interface that you will have got to Zoom via, you'll see there are a number of polls. So in the Hoover interface, the web version at least, it's off on the right. And to start off with, what we'd like you to do is answer the those 5 polls. Yes, 5 polls. So what do you think of when you've hear the word commons? Have you heard of us before? What sort of organization are you from? What country are you based in? It's a global open research commons after all. We're interested in the distribution. And in particular, which areas are you interested in learning more about? So if people could just flick across and answer the polls, and then I'd just like to go through those so that you have a sense of who else is here. For those of you who've just joined, a couple of those polls have been reconfigured, and if you've answered them already, you'll need to answer them again. The ones that have word cloud and checkbox after are the ones that we had to reconfigure, caused by user error at my end. So, okay, that's great. We're getting responses coming in. Okay. Actually, given you're sharing your screen already, CJ, why don't you just show the results for the first one? Have you heard of us before? They're not quite in the sequence. Okay, so half of the people there have heard of us. A small number are unsure whether they've heard of us before. Clearly, we need to work on our relentless marketing campaign. So, okay, that's good. It's great that some of you are here despite not having heard of us. Hopefully, by the end of this session, you'll have a better sense of what we're trying to do. Maybe the next one, what sort of organization are you from? Okay, so what we have is um, quite a number from research institutes, a reasonable number from service providers, reasonable number from other, which is interesting. I wonder now whether, hmm, yeah, it's not easy to work out what the other would be, but it's interesting that there are so many from a category other than service provider and research institute. So thank you for that. Next one, please, CJ. What country are you based in? Okay, so a mix there. I'm sorry, does anyone, sorry, Rory, or CJ, do you know what CR is as a country code? Costa Rica, probably. If you are from Costa Rica, please just let us know in chat. Okay, so
Or if you know what
that's,
CR means, otherwise.
yeah, yeah, indeed. Okay, so not doing so well on the global south. Sorry, I should have answered the poll as well, which would have at least given one for Australia. Okay, that's an interesting distribution. Next one. Okay, so what do you think of when you hear the word commons? So we can't probably make that any larger. Oh, you can make it larger.
Okay, no, that doesn't work. I could download
That
it.
is not what we want.
Oh,
Um,
just my response. Nope, which I didn't
nope.
put in. Share.
Share your results from the session? Probably not. Yeah, there doesn't appear to be any easy way of making that larger, which is annoying. Well, try. What happens if you share your results from the session? You just get that?
Yeah, that's what I'm clicking.
Okay. No, no, that's weird. Okay, let me. Okay, I think the
That
conclusion here is that
made it
whoever's
a
word.
little bit better. Shared space,
Yeah,
land
it's
sharing, integrated infrastructure, Boston Common, and infrastructure.
yeah, okay. Okay, so people are thinking of physical commons there rather than with. I guess infrastructure is not a physical commons. Okay, so the takeaway there, I think, is we don't want to use Hoover's word cloud feature. That was a mistake. But I've never used it before. So, and the one that I guess I'm most interested in for the icebreaker, or at least we're most interested in, is what areas are you interested in learning more about? So, revisions to the model, adoption, support, and feedback, mapping it onto relevant frameworks, alternative ways of visualizing it, uh, expanding the scope. Okay, interesting, and maturity models. I think we're going to touch on all of those, and there's also some overlap between some of those topics and some of the things that were discussed in a separate session yesterday, for me at least, looking at mapping the landscape of research tools that Rory's been co-chairing. All right, thank you for that. We have a nice diverse group, a mix of people that have heard of us and haven't heard of us, and so it's great. Okay, over to you, CJ. Or is it
Um,
over to me again?
so I think I'll introduce the idea of the GORC, and then I'll pass it over to you to talk about the interest groups supporting outputs,
Yep,
if that
that's
works.
great. Sure.
So the idea of a global open research commons is the integration of research commons, I guess, on the basis of it. But research commons kind of refer to things that might have other names like data commons or open science clouds or open science spaces. And then we're kind of trying to expand that from science to the site to a wider idea of research, which encompasses more than science research. Um, and so what we kind of think about when we think of commons, getting towards this global open research commons, which would be an interconnection of them, are things like the European Open Science Cloud, the Digital Research Alliance of Canada, the wow, the Australia Research Data Commons. I almost forgot the acronym for you, Andrew. I'm so sorry. As well as many others that are around in and building in this space too. And so the idea of the GORC is that you would have an interconnection between them such that you have access to research artifacts of all kinds, data, publication, software, and compute that are relying on services that are accessible by everyone everywhere at all times with the appropriate protocols and procedures in place. And that's an important part, of course, when we think about things like sensitive data or things requiring access management. So the interest group, which Andrew will talk about a little bit more, but a brief overview is that it's a space where people can come together to talk about these open research commons and to think about global alignment for the priorities of commons development. So not just moving forward for things that are already in place, but also the building of commons. And the idea is to create a roadmap towards this global interoperability. The International Model Working Group within the GORC umbrella is a working group that was set with a specific target of creating a model to describe what are the considerations that go into building, expanding, and running a commons, or something that you would aim towards an open research commons that could then fit into something like the GORC. And so the model is really emphasizing on the what do you need to consider. It's a non-prescriptive model that we'll talk about a little bit later too. And the idea is that the model provides the what, the roadmap will provide the how, or part of the how anyway, and together they would lead into a global open research commons network. That's kind of the goal that we're aiming for. Oh, Andrew, yeah,
Okay. Sorry, could you just leave that slide up there for a minute before you flick on to the next one, CJ?
for sure.
But that's, you wanted me to move on to the interest group?
Yeah,
Yeah, okay. So the reason I wanted that slide to come up, to stay up, is that CJ, there's another arrow that for me at least, is implied there. And that is that the International Model Working Group is informed by the work of the interest group, and it informs it. So the interest group was trying to look at existing commons and come up with a way of understanding them. The international model used that way of looking at the world to explore the areas that might be needed. And some of the adoption case studies that we'll hear a little bit more about later on in this session are testing that model to see how well it works in reality, and will probably feed into a revision. So those two groups are actually quite coupled in terms of the way that they're informing one another. Next slide, please, CJ. So for those of you that are unfamiliar with the way RDA works, interest groups have a longer duration and don't necessarily produce outputs. Working groups have a short duration, usually 12 to 18 months, and do produce outputs. But occasionally you have interest groups that produce something, from time to time, interest groups will want to produce outputs. And for reasons buried in the past of RDA, these are called supporting outputs. But often they're valuable in their own right. And so this is why this thing's labeled as a supporting output rather than just as an output. So this is the result of the work of the interest group, where we looked at a range of existing commons and we tried to abstract from them what are the common elements, or rather, what are the essential elements that you need. And just to be clear, and CJ said this already, but let me emphasize this, saying that these elements are essential does not say how you have to fulfill these elements. It simply says you need to have these elements, or you need to have at least considered these elements. But let me just quickly take you through this. The bottom three hexagons, the kind of mid-blue hexagons, are what you might think of as the technology elements. And typically when people think of a research data commons, they think of the technology pieces. And in fact, the infrastructure answers in that word cloud, that exercise that we did just before, reflect that. So the technology elements in a commons are the box on the left, compute, storage, network, AAIs, access and authentication infrastructure. So that, if you like, is the underpinning generic technology platforms. The research objects are the things the commons stores, typically data, but it could also be software and models and workflows and maybe even publications. And the services and tools are the ways that people interact with the commons. And the group that Rory is co-chairing has spent, the working group that he's co-chairing has spent the last 18 months really pulling apart that services and tools piece and saying, okay, what are the kinds of services and tools contained? And you'll hear a bit more about that later on. The insight that we developed as we worked through this model was, okay, the technology pieces, those mid-blue bits, are necessary, but they're not sufficient. You need more. And that's why we have those white hexagons across the top. And these are, if you like, the human or organizational aspects of the commons that are required. Obviously, you need human capacity. You need people to maintain the commons and make sure that it will work. You need rules of participation and access. That is, how do you contribute to the commons? How do you get access to stuff that's in the commons? What are the rules around being a service provider or a data provider? What are the rules around being a commons user? You need some kind of governance structure to make sure that your commons is operated effectively. You need a way of engaging with your users, and you need something to ensure that your commons is sustainable, or at least sustainable for as long as it needs to be. Particularly in the case of research, you need to be able to rely on research infrastructure over a longer period of time so that you can go back and validate findings from 10, 20, 30 years ago. And as a result, you need a longer term sustainability answer. And then in the middle of the model, there is this interoperability and standards piece, reflecting the fact that in order for a commons to work, it needs to revolve around the questions of interoperability and the standards that make interoperability possible. Interoperability in this case is I guess, kind of a reference to the I in FAIR, findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable. But it's certainly what we're trying to achieve in the commons. So this diagram is the result of the work of the interest group. There is an accompanying set of definitions for this, because once we developed the diagram, we realized that not everybody was interpreting those words in the same way. So we have an accompanying document that explains carefully what we mean by each of those, what's in scope, what's out of scope. And we have a report that describes the work that we undertook to develop the typology and the definition. And all of that's available on the RDA website. If it's not in the collaborative notes document, okay, the links, yeah. So the links to the typology and definitions and the report are in the collaborative notes document, as well as the link to the interest group itself. This is version 1 of the model. Well, technically it's version 1.2 of the diagram, but it's version 1 of the intellectual work. And we're currently, as you'll hear later on, in the process of putting this into practice. Given that we're a small group, CJ, I'm wondering if it might be useful just to stop there for questions, see if anyone's got any questions.
Yeah, especially where there were a number of folks who had not heard of the group or weren't sure that they had heard of the group before.
Yeah.
The typology of essential elements that Andrew's just walked through is really the underpinnings of everything the GORC groups have been working on for over the past year. So definitely, if anyone has any questions or something's unclear, or you're wondering like, why does it look like this and why didn't we consider something else, we're happy to answer those questions.
Yep.
Or get stumped by them and then incorporate them later.
Sure, either way, it's a win for us. As CJ says, it's a small group. If people would like to just unmute and ask questions, and we'll give it a little while, and I don't know, half a minute or so. And if no one wants to ask a question, which is fine, then we're happy to move on. But now, if there's something that was unclear, now would be a good time. I suspect we're good then.
Yeah. Again, please feel free to raise hands as you have questions or concerns or something doesn't make sense. Uh, and we're happy to answer things throughout. And then you're also welcome to add things in the chat too. So all of those things are fine.
Yep.
Okay, so the typology, something that Andrew did not mention is the typology was endorsed in July of 2023, right? July?
Yep. Yep.
Yeah, okay. I don't know, that summer was a whirlwind, I know, for a lot of reasons, mostly to do with the GORB groups. So the typology was endorsed in July, and as Andrew said, like it was really a back and forth between the development of the typology, which is these essential elements, and the model. So the model was being developed and rolled out as a set of attributes or characteristics of these essential elements in regards to a speaker series. And it was decided that using the typology as a container or initial starting point to give the model structure was where we wanted to go, just as a place to start with. So the typology was endorsed. That's great. I mentioned that so the model was being influenced by the typology. The model also influenced the typology. That's why there's a version 1.2 of the diagram, is because some of the words slightly changed depending on what was found in the model. The essential ideas didn't, but the labels did. But we also had a speaker series of 12 folks from different commons across the globe. Some of them were discipline specific, some of them were generic, some of them were national, some of them were pan-national. And in the case of one that was fully international, the IVOA. So we heard from 12 speakers at various ranges of maturity and scale and scope. We did a phase 1 and 2 literature review, which had over 150 resources that was analyzed from the DRI community as well as from our speakers. And this went through an iterative process with our task groups and our working group to kind of go through various iterations of the model. We ended up calling them silly things like version 0.5, 0.6, 0.9, and 1. But in total, there was about 5 versions of the model if you don't count the initial draft of mess that I created. And so the working group also had a kind of 7th task group that created a narrative report. So the outputs of this group were the model and the report. And both of those were endorsed by RDA in October 2023 during International Data Week. And just some stats is like we did have 28 working group meetings leading up to the creation of the model and the report, but there were a lot of task group meetings and writing meetings that happened outside of our monthly working group meetings, where folks were sometimes meeting once or twice a week for 8 or 9 months on end. It was quite intense. So I'm not going to go through everything because I do want to watch our time and have a discussion on what comes next. But again, keeping in mind that folks might not have come across this before, the model is really intended as a non-prescriptive guide. And stakeholders includes everybody, people who are building commons, who are funding commons, who are writing policy that affect digital research infrastructure, everything and anything that has to do with that space. The model has something for you to consider. It's currently in a spreadsheet. It's organized by the essential elements, but it's also broken down into categories and subcategories. So there's finer detail and granularity in there, depending on the level of detail that you want or need for your discussions. And everything has an extended description, examples where we could find them, sources where we extracted it from, as well as a consideration level, because some things within the model might be more core or more optional, depending on where you are in your maturity. And there's also a glossary that include a lot of the definitions that were in the IG typology, as well as definitions that we needed to nail down as we developed the model. And of course, KPIs and metrics, because where would you be if you could measure success? So there's a list of 95 possible suggestions for key performance indicators and metrics that folks can consider implementing as they say do annual reporting and that sort of thing. The report is all the background information and intent. It gives you a much more detailed methodology than what I've just said, a narrative summary of the model in case spreadsheets aren't your thing to read, as well as current intended use and areas of future work, which is what we're going to be focusing on today. Very shortly about the model structure. So these essential elements are hexagons, and they can be broken down into categories and subcategories. These entities can have characteristics, which are attributes and the more granular features. And the idea is that characteristics are inherited from parent to child. So if an essential element has an attribute, maybe that attribute has a feature. If the essential element also has a category, the attribute and feature are inherited to the category and then inherited to any subcategories that might exist. And it looks like this in a spreadsheet, pretty flat. It is available on Google Drive if people would like to go in and leave comments. We ask you not to change the individual cells, please. It is a live version 1.0, but the comments will help feed discussion for a version 2.0 or even intermediate revisions. Some takeaways we got from IDW 23 or the last plenary. Everybody loves this hexagon diagram, the one that Andrew talked through. That is like the key ingredient. Nobody likes the spreadsheet. I get it. It's not nice to look at, but the diagram, beautiful, wonderful. The vocabulary provided by the model, however, is really useful, and we do have it in a demo version hosted on ARDC servers for now, and we're hoping that when the RDA website is fully up and running, it'll actually be used more formally within RDA. That's what the techs have told us anyway. Implementation of the model, as well as the maturity levels for each item are needed. Those are some areas of future work that we're going to talk about. And working examples of or profiles of the model are also needed. So things like adoption, and we actually also have a birds of a feather session for having a health data specific profile of the model too, which if you didn't catch it this morning, it's also happening next week in a repeat session. Okay, so next is adoption stories. And we've got a number of adopters, one of whom is able to be with us today. So we might cut the panel discussion short and move into a different presentation around forward future thinking. But we are working with Elixir, in particular with Volmar, with Surf in the Netherlands, and with Rory and Philip, who are trying to create or have proposed a national infrastructure for Norway called Reason. And so we do have recordings from Martin and Philip, and so we'll hear those now around their experience with adoption. And if you want to attend our repeat session next week, we'll actually have all the adopters present where we'll be able to do a full panel discussion. Anything you want to add on that, Andrew, before I jump into the videos?
Oh, that's great, CJ. Thank you.
Any questions about the model before we jump into the videos on adoption? I probably should have stopped here and said, do we have any questions? My apologies, folks.
So a question from me, CJ. Thinking about a discussion in one of the sessions yesterday. Are you/we thinking about alternative representations of the spreadsheet beyond the report and the relatively flat spreadsheet? And if so, what would those look like?
The short answer is yes, but my existential sigh is that moving something that has now been created in the spreadsheet and lives in the spreadsheet, moving it is hard. And we need dedicated time and resources to do that. And testing different containers only for them to fail or not be the right fit is, I'm very tempted to call it wasted time, although I feel like, trialing something and having it fail shouldn't necessarily be considered like that. So I think ultimately there are some options, like a knowledge graph type of representation, like on Kumu, which is something that I had started doing, but stopped with my transition from the World Data System to the Digital Research Alliance of Canada, which you'll notice my background is different for those that have seen me present before. So there's been some pause in that work, but yeah, changing the container or offering a different visualization, especially one that's interactive, has been one that's been on the back burner for a long time, but we've never pushed it forward to the forefront.
Yeah, so the reason I asked is that in the session that Rory was presenting in yesterday, there was some discussion about different exercises of mapping tools, most of which started off with a spreadsheet, but all of which had slightly different spreadsheets, and whether there was some way of converging on a common representation. I think this is a conversation that we're going to be having for another couple of years yet. So, Rory, did you want to weigh in on that one?
Yeah, I just thought, first of all, to echo CJ's point, in the model that the exercise we're engaged in, which I'm going to describe in the mapping the landscape of digital research tools, the only reason that we actually ended up going for a visualization is because one of the co-chairs of our group had both the capability to develop a visualization and the imagination to figure out how to go about doing it. So it's going to be quite idiosyncratic. It's going to be open, but it's going to be quite idiosyncratic. And whether or not we'll be successful, time will tell. But if it was the case that you'd have to outsource this and get it done, I think it would be like developing a website. It would take forever. And as CJ says, the chances of success are mixed at best. So the question in my mind would be, given limited resources and time, is that a priority to think about as to other ways in which the group might be spending its time?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very wise reflection.
Are there any other points that folks would like to bring up around the model at this point, or even specifically around model representation? No? Okay. So I've introduced our adopters already, and so now we'll hear from them. I'll be able to hear the sound, and I should have Zoom set up such that you will be able to hear the sound too, but please sound off if you see Philip talking and you're not hearing anything. So we'll hear first from Philip, who recorded the session, and then we'll hear from Martin.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session. My name is Philip.
And I'm Rory.
So thank you all for inviting us to present our adoption story of the GORC model. This presentation has 3 short sections. I will start off telling you a little bit about what we actually did with the GORC model, and then I'll continue in the section 2, presenting briefly what we found helpful with the model, and then Rory will finishing up this, presenting what kind of issues we encountered with the model, using the model. So let's start with the first section. What did we actually do with the GORC model? So basically we used the GORC model as a reference model or framework for a major grant proposal that we submitted last November last year to the Research Council of Norway for funding to establish Research Commons for Norway, or in short, REASON. And REASON is a proposed generalist research infrastructure for Norway, which complements and supplements domain-specific and other specialized infrastructures, and which also includes the 9 essential elements of the GORC model. This proposal is now under evaluation, and we will be notified of the outcome in November this year. So let's move on to the second section. Where did we find the GORC model useful for our work? Well, the most crucial point to make here is that without using the GORC model as the essential reference model or framework, we couldn't have submitted our proposal, because we ended up with a very limited amount of time at the end. And using the GORC model as a reference model was very useful to us. And also, in our view, the availability of the GORC model provides, for the first time, a globally accepted template for Research Commons. And also, Research Commons are now increasingly seen as the best internationally recognized model for delivery of integrated research services. And together, this meant that we were able to demonstrate that our proposal, or our proposed infrastructure, is aligned with a larger international approach to establish and operate interoperable research infrastructures. And on a more detailed level, of course, the GORC model provided us with a lot of useful information and guidance on how to establish the different elements that are necessary in a Research Commons. And with that, I hand over to Rory.
Yes, so first, just to echo what Philip said, the GORC model was really, it was the the excuse, the environment, the context, as well as the model for everything that we did. So without the GORC model, the project wouldn't have happened. So in pointing out some issues that we encountered, I'm not at all meaning to be critical, just the opposite, and hoping to maybe think about some things which could be improved as the GORC model continues to evolve. So just to highlight three things. First of all, there's obviously variation in how well described the different elements are in the high-level description. That in itself is okay. In some cases, there was almost too much detail. And in particular, when you look at it's a huge task to do, as we did, to put together an actual full proposal for a fully featured GORC. And in some cases, the extensive detail can be a bit overwhelming. Second, the interaction between three of the technical elements, i.e. storage, compute, networking, on the one hand, services and tools, and interoperability, it seems to us to be a critical component of a working GORC. But this interaction is not very well covered in version 1 of the model, so something to think about going forward. And third, and this is also pretty fundamental, the model's a model, but it doesn't really take into account the need to get buy-in and support from multiple people and organizations if you're actually going to think about designing and implementing a GORC. And the reality is that in many cases, these organizations and people may have, in some cases, conflicting or even competing interests. And so the process of gathering together the support, the human support that's needed and the organizational support actually turned out to be quite messy. And we suspect this is likely to be the case in many cases. Not sure to what extent the model can account for this as a model, but it is something to think about, and possibly there could be some way of addressing this, or at least acknowledging it as the model is built going forward. So thank you very much. Yes, thanks very much.
Yeah, hopefully this is useful for the further discussion in this session. Thank you.
All right, and so ironically, we do have Rory here, but we have another lightning talk that we'll hear from Martin first, and then if we have questions around adoption, we can go into that. Andrew, you have a hand raised.
Sorry, can I ask a quick question of clarification of Rory, given that he's here?
Rory, do you have any qualms?
Okay. Well, okay, so maybe
I'm unmuted. Sorry, I was just trying to unmute. Yes, I'm here. Sorry.
No, that's okay. Sorry, that last slide, the interaction between the three technical elements. So when I saw the bullet point, it sounded like you meant the three mid blue elements around
Hello.
the bottom. The infrastructure, the research objects, and the services and tools. But the way you described it in the video was it was the infrastructure, the interoperability, and the tools.
Good catch,
So
Andrew. Yes, you've got to watch yourself when you're dealing with Andrew. If you make up any slip ups, he'll catch it for sure. Absolutely.
I'm just trying to understand.
There's a disconnect. So what I articulated verbally was actually what I meant, and I don't think it was, as you say, it was inaccurately described in the 3 bullet points.
No, that makes sense. And when you described it, I thought, yeah, okay, I can absolutely see what you're getting at there. So, all right, thank you. That's very helpful.
All right, so following with another lightning talk from Martin, who is not present today, but at least we can hear the experience from Surf.
Thank you for inviting us to share our experience with the GORC model. My name is Maarten Hogewerf, working as an architect for SURF, a cooperative for educational and research institutions. In this short presentation, I will explain some background, how we used GORC, what worked, and where we see opportunities for further work. There's growing awareness for public values in digital commons in the Netherlands. A recent report from our national program on open science concluded that we have a rich but fragmented and confusing data landscape, and that by forming a network as a commons, we can enhance coordination and connect better to the expertise and experience that is available in the European and international context. Parallel, our Minister for Digitalization in the Netherlands sent a letter to our parliament recommending that we should shape alternative technologies to reduce unwanted dependencies on non-values-driven providers, the big tech, and that digital commons offer a suitable model for this. We are also preparing discussions how the Netherlands can connect to the EOSC Federation as one or more nodes. An important element of this preparation is to have an overview of our rich but fragmented and confusing landscape. We agreed to start with a small inventory within SURF and a few other organizations to identify what we do, what bottlenecks and opportunities are, and where we want to collaborate. And we want to try the GORC model as a common language and see if this can help, in particular because we all want to stress that our landscape is a lot more than just technical facilities. The initial inventory would be carried out via semi-structured dialogues using the GORC model. For the dialogues, we wanted to discuss the categories and attributes behind the 9 elements. And for that, we started to interpret or summarize the Excel sheet. This is something that we had already started as GORC enthusiasts, and from that, we derived some easy-to-use questions to drive our dialogues. I'm confident, by the way, that we didn't do a perfect interpretation, but good enough to support our dialogues. All these preparations also helped us to get familiar with much that is behind the model, and the dialogues were in general very natural. By just asking the participants to tell us about their activities, we already got input about many of the elements, and halfway the dialogue we used the prepared questions to fill in the blanks. And this part was also appreciated by the participants, as it gave them food for thought about many aspects that they had not considered yet. And we should note that some of the initiatives were at a very early stage. So what can we learn thanks to the GORC model? Well, that all the initiatives or participants recognized each of the 9 elements in their activities, that they share a common intent, though on different levels, ultimately to support researchers to do the best possible research. That the blue technical hexagons need the white human social ones, and vice versa. That all the elements of their activities are interconnected. Good training requires you to have knowledge for which you need human capacity, engagement, so be involved in state-of-the-art international projects, etc. That all the initiatives share challenges with regards to engagement, to sustainability, or with respect to their locally focused mandates. And that all participants were or became enthusiastic about the GORC model and wanted to know more about it. So what could have been better? Well, there's a knowledge gap between the 9 essential elements and the Excel sheet that is behind it. So I think we need further work to make that information better accessible. And also I think we can provide guidance or examples to use the GORC model in more complex or more informal initiatives. For example, to determine the right scoping when using it in the complex initiatives, or to help people use it in more informal initiatives, so that they also recognize that they are a commons. And this was our experience. Thank you and good luck with the rest of the session.
Great. And so our original plan was to move into a panel discussion. And Andrew, I've done a ton of talking so far, so I'm going to hand it over to you. if you'd like it. We only have Rory, but if there's any discussion that maybe we can have in the room too.
Okay, thanks, CJ. Actually, maybe CJ, if you can just pull up the poll saying what people wanted to talk about again. Okay, so model revisions. So the speakers have talked about the need for that. Adoption support, Martin was just talking about that. Mapping onto the relevant frameworks, we haven't talked about that so much. Visualizations has come up already briefly. Expanding the scope, we haven't talked about yet. And maturity models, I think we've covered that a little bit. And implementation maps. Yeah, that's some of what they're already working on in the Netherlands. Okay, thanks. That's helpful. So maybe given that Rory is here, Rory, is there anything you wanted to add to the reason video?
No, not really. I think there's already some things there in the two videos for discussion. I don't want to muddy the waters by trying to, and I can't think of anything particularly pertinent or intelligent to add either at this point. So no.
Plus, it's after midnight for you, so it's
That's
not a
true.
fair question. So, yeah. Okay, so to the attendees, you've now had an overview of the model and the typology of elements. You've heard from two different implementation case studies. And for those of you that are brave enough to come to the repeat session, you'll get to hear from a third one there from Elixir. Are there any questions based on what you've heard that CJ or I or Rory could answer? Okay, so Andrea, thank you. How do you view this overlapping or complementing other frameworks like RDAV or the organizational one from, sorry, Andrea, you have to explain to me what you mean by the organizational one from the ARDC. I work for the ARDC, but I just want to make sure
I
that
know.
I'm
I
answering.
was like, I'm going to get that wrong.
You're not going to get it wrong. I just don't understand it. Do you mean
so
our thematic research data commons?
No, the research data management framework for institutions, that one. How?
That one. Okay.
Yeah, that one.
Okay, so that is a really good question, Andrea. I'm trying to think of the best way of answering this. There is probably a near infinite number of ways of slicing up the research ecosystem. And indeed, the group that Rory has been co-chairing has had a significant task in just looking at the landscape of tools and services. And so I guess we see our model as a way of trying to abstract what you need to build either a national or a discipline research data commons. And the institutional elements that you're describing are contributors to a national research data commons, but they're not a commons on their own. So a university would not be trying to build a research data commons, but it is trying to manage the research outputs produced by its researchers. And so it will have a number of those elements that we've already looked at. In fact, it probably would need to have, just trying to think about it, it would probably need to have actually all of those elements, although it wouldn't necessarily describe itself in those terms. So you could view it as a way of looking at what a university is trying to do, even though the university is not necessarily trying to produce a commons. So the last slide from Martin Hulkenberg, where he's talking about how it would be good to provide guidance on how to use the model in different settings. I hadn't thought about an institutional setting as an application of the model, but I can now kind of see fuzzily in my head how you might be able to use it. Indeed, one of the possible future pieces of work might be looking at how you would apply it in an institutional setting and how it would overlap onto the work that we've already done in the ARDC around institutions. Sorry, that was a long and somewhat rambling answer to a very concise question, but hopefully that was of some use.
Yeah, so that I like your perspective since you are from ARDC. With that one, I've been trying to wrestle with where does RDAV fit into the whole landscape of frameworks, including GORC, ARDCs, all these others. And I think with this one, I can't decide if it's an abstraction above or below the GORC. I think it is above because we've tried to make it discipline and institutional level agnostic. Like I'm just trying to imagine a Venn diagram of all the different frameworks out there and where we overlap and complement each other, where our strengths are versus with this one and the like. So yeah, that's all.
No, that's really helpful. And I have to confess that I've looked briefly at the RDAV. So I'll just put the link in chat for that. This is the research data framework developed. Was it developed at NIST or by NIST? This is how little I understand about it.
So we developed it with help from about 300 different stakeholders from all over, but we had to stamp it with NIST so that we could get it published. But it's not NIST's product at all.
Okay, thank you. That's useful. Okay, I'll put in a link to the ARDC institutional approach as well once I finish the session. That'll be in the collaborative notes.
So I just put a link into our sort of web app version of it, which
okay, thanks.
is somewhat better than the spreadsheets and the PDFs we had before, but is still not ideal.
Yep, okay. All right, thanks. There are a number of these kinds of activities underway. They all have use in different settings, I guess. One of the, without wishing to seem over proud of my own child, one of the things that seems to have resonated with our approach is that it is sufficiently general that people can look at it and say, yeah, that makes sense. Senior management can look at it and go, yep, that's a finite number of things. I think I understand what each of those things is. I think I understand why we would need them. And yet it's also has sufficient explanatory power, noting the comments about all the ways in which it could be better, which are great. It has sufficient explanatory power to work for people who are actually trying to build these things. And that is actually a comment that I did want to make. We see two kinds of uses for the typology of elements. One is as a structure for trying to build something new. And so reason is a nice example of that. Where it's essentially making sure you don't miss out on anything. And the other way in which we see it being used is as a way of thinking about something that exists already. And in fact, the surf example is a nice use case there. So what surf is doing is using it, as they say, to create this inventory of what they've got. And so they're using it as a structuring framework for the inventory. And I think part of the attraction of the model is that it can be used in both of those ways, both as a way of helping you decide what you want to build, and indeed provide some guidance on how to build it, and as a way of looking at what you've got. And I think we're going to see examples of both of those going forward.
Andrew,
I can't believe I said going forward. Yeah.
Can I just pick up on, I think
Yeah.
Andrea's question was about the frameworks, but in answering Andrea's question, you also touched on the point of a national or multi-institutional or regional. That's kind of, I think, your perhaps the common. I'm thinking about what a commons is. It wouldn't be a university or an institution, but I've just put a link in the chat to a counterexample to that, which is a video of an interesting presentation which was made about Harvard Data Connect, as they call it, a couple of months ago, which is a research. They don't call it a research commons. In fact, they actually said we don't want to call it a commons because we got tired of that name. Interestingly, I don't know why. They call it Data Connect. It is, we would all say it. There it is. It's a commons, and there it is. They're a university, and there it is. They're implementing it. So I think that the model. There's one example of an institution that actually found they didn't explicitly refer to the GORC, but when it was pointed out, I gave a presentation really saying what they're doing is very much like the GORC in many ways, and they got it and they agreed. So I'm not so sure about the point about institutions, and to some extent, it will be the market that decides where the model's applied, not the creators of the model. And there's an example of anyway. Just I think there is an institutional. There are cases in which some institutions will actually find the model quite useful and try to in many ways recreate what national bodies are doing as well.
Yeah, that's actually a very insightful comment, Rory. Thank you.
I might just add very quickly regarding RDAF as well as institutional use of the model. Both versions of RDAF that were published before October 2023, Andrea, were used as major inputs into the creation of the GORC model. So we don't have an explicit mapping to show like exactly where things lie in a hierarchy or in a Venn diagram, but a lot of the GORC model was actually founded in RDAF. Not everything, because we did find that the GORC model had a little bit more dimensions, and it also didn't go into as much detail. But it's you can look. There's something like out of the 400 items, I think 125 or something like that are actually from RDAF. It's quite extensive.
Oh wow.
Oh yeah, like I can't
Okay,
I'm saying that number off the top of my head, but I would need to do a real count. But it's a lot, and it's in pretty much every essential element. There's at least one or two, and in many of them there's a lot more. In terms of the institutions, we have been doing a little bit of a roadshow with the GORC model, and in particular for me, where I live in Canada, and it's easy for me to attend conferences virtually in the time zones for the Americas. I have been presenting at conferences that talk to academic libraries and institutions that would have, say, maybe not a full-scale commons, Rory, as you've demonstrated, but folks that have institutional repositories and want to build up commons-like structures, even in a fragmented landscape like the United States. And so I've been kind of positioning the model as maybe you're definitely not going to have as much in this model as EOSC would, right? Like that's insane for an institution to try and aim for that level of encompassment. But you could still approach the model with the exact same intention of these are considerations for you, and you decide which ones are important for you with your with your budgeting and staff and resources available. Because there is really something there for any scale of implementation, even if they're not called commons, maybe they're spaces or data connect. And just looking at the time, and Rory, I do appreciate it's super late for you. Rory is also going to give us has been kind enough to offer to do a small presentation on this model that we keep referring to in this working group that he's chairing that we keep talking about. So let's actually talk about it, because we're kind of edging in that direction of mapping and other models and how they fit together. So Rory, you let me know when you want your slides changed and you can take it away.
Okay, well, I'm sure by now everyone's sick of me and they're hoping I'll fall asleep soon, which is likely to happen. So this is the last you're going to hear from me. You can get rid of me soon. But yes, I guess you can. Next slide, please. Thanks. And then next slide. Yeah. So I've been co-chair, as it has been mentioned, of another working group, which is just this month finishing up our work. And it's called Mapping the Landscape of Digital Research Tools, or Mapping the Landscape of Digital Research Tools. I got the name wrong there. And for those of you, we had a very good session, which Andrew kindly joined and participated in this morning. But if anyone's interested, we have a repeat session next Tuesday. So please do come if you like. And thanks, Andrea, who's just been involved in the discussion here, was also active in this project. Next slide, please. So we had 3 deliverables, and the first deliverable, and because I was involved in the GORC group, I think I was able to kind of usefully take some of the experience and lessons learned from developing the GORC, and we were able to apply them. So the first thing we did, the first deliverable was coming up with a harmonized model of the famous digital research lifecycle, and we took, how many is it, 20 some examples, and tried to, and this was done through a community effort. It wasn't just the co-chairs, and then came up with 5 models which we thought were good, representative, whatever. And then you can't see it here, but we did quite a detailed scoping exercise and tried to figure out how they could be harmonized. And the graphic you see on the right, it's not really rocket science, and it's not that different from the other ones, but it tries to incorporate the best elements and the representative elements of many of the more, what were seen to be the more useful models. So the first deliverable and our starting point was this harmonized model of the digital research lifecycle. Next slide, please. So we then moved on to the next stage, which was really the guts of what we did, and the hardest one. So I think there are 11 or 12 stages. For each stage, we started out, I won't go into too much into the process because this is just very brief, but so actually I won't go into the process at all. But in the end, we for each stage, we came up with 3 categories of tools, or tools which were commonly used in that stage of the research life cycle. And then for each category, we came up with 3 examples of tools which, again, were representative and commonly used in those categories. So really what the model consists of is you have the stages, and then you have the categories, and then you have the examples. Next slide, please. So this doesn't mean anything, and I was hoping, because we're just, as the visualization, as has been mentioned, is not an easy thing to do, and Andrew saw kind of more detail about the visualization, which is coming together, but there's not really time to go into that now. But suffice to say that there's going to be kind of an interactive and interoperable visualization of in effect this previous slide with the tools, the categories, and the examples, in ways in which you can see them in different ways and hopefully make sense of them. So that is our last output, which hopefully will be ready very soon. And then, as is the case, or was the case with the GORC, we will, in addition to publishing the deliverables themselves, we've also written a report about how we got there, yeah. And then I think the last slide, we can move to the last slide. So very much like the GORC, we think that what we've done is kind of version 1.0, and there's plenty of scope for further development. So we are planning to propose a follow-up group, which I think will be a working group, because we think there's some outputs that we would like to work on, and not just an interest group. So the plans for the group are, first of all, to continue developing the model. So some of the things, for example, we thought about trying to put some attributes onto each of the example tools. Like, for example, are they open source or closed source? To what extent are they interoperable? But we didn't really have time to get into that. So one of the things we'd like to explore is adding some attributes. That's one way in which we think we can continue to develop the model. We want to explore sustainability options, and this was something which came up in the session this morning. Clearly, you can't have ongoing working groups for the next 20 years. That's not going to work. But if you want to be sustainable, you need to think of other options. So we want to explore those. And then most pertinent to this group, but I think also fundamental to our thinking, they're clearly, I think no one could contest the fact that there are potentially exciting synergies and joint development opportunities with the GORC model, in particular the tools and services element of the GORC model, where what we've done hopefully could inform further development of that element of the GORC model. That's kind of at a nuts and bolts level, if you will. I think there's also, I think both, as I said in my comments about the GORC model, and certainly one of the things we did not explore at all with the Maldrith model is interoperability between tools and services. And I think there's opportunities for us to work jointly with the GORC group in the area of interoperability. And then finally, I saw it on this slide, but Andrew, it kind of came up, I think, as in some of the comments this morning about, oh, well, people were saying, well, yes, people have been coming up with these kind of models for the last 20 years and they're great, and then they just kind of wither away and die. Well, actually, I feel like based on what I've seen from I think, pretty dramatic interest in the GORC model, it's only been 6 months. It's a lot more than that. It needs to be developed, but it's got real potential. And I think that the Maldrith model I think the GORC model to me is probably kind of the benchmark or the lodestone. But I think the Maldrith model can contribute to the momentum that the GORC model has, and that together there's a fighting chance that they will overcome this kind of pattern of, yes, it's there, and then 2 years later it's gone. And that together we have both the substantive quality and also the momentum to find sustainability models which will enable these things to actually take on a life of their own. So certainly from the side of the Maldrith group, we're very keen to actively explore collaboration with the various GORC models and offshoots that are coming into existence.
Thanks, Roy. That's great, and remarkably coherent given the time of night. I guess the only comment I would add to that is that 2 comments. Firstly, the fact that the GORC model is being picked up by national level initiatives is, I think, a good sign in terms of its sustainability. I mean, SURF is a large organization. If Norway goes ahead and implements Reason, that's again, it's another national approach. So that I think speaks well of the potential for at least immediate sustainability. And then the other thing that just occurred to me as you were speaking is that you could kind of regard what you're doing in Maldrith as taking one of those hexagons and drilling down into it and unpacking it. And I can imagine that you could do similar things with a number of the other ones. What would it look like to unpack sustainability, for instance? What would it look like to unpack research objects? So I think you can think of the GORC model as a high-level structuring framework where you need to do more detail. There was a comment that was made in one of the meetings I was in a couple of weeks ago that when we developed the model, we centered it around interoperability and standards. We said, yeah, obviously interoperability and standards are the most important thing. And yet one of the meetings I was in looked at that and said, oh, no, clearly that's wrong. Obviously it's the research objects that are at the center. That's the most important thing because they're the things that are going to endure. And we had a useful discussion about that. And where we landed at the end of that discussion was you could imagine a version of the Gork model where almost everything is at the center, depending on where you're coming from. If you're a funder, maybe it's sustainability that's at the center. If you're a CIO, maybe it's the technology hexagon that's at the center. It's an interesting idea and one that I'm kind of playing around with in my head, thinking how useful that would be. Anyway, just a throwaway comment. Are there any other questions? You've heard a range of uses of the model. You've seen some examples of how we put it together. There's a lot more detail in the underpinning work that we did to develop the international model, in particular, that large spreadsheet. CJ did a huge amount of work looking across a very wide range of resources, and that's available for you to look at as well. But are there any questions? What have we got? 12 minutes. Any questions that people have got, having heard the presentation so far? Oh, okay, yeah, we should probably do that. Thanks, CJ.
No, just in terms of like helping people structure their questions, anything, especially, but just so that Roy might even get a couple more minutes of sleep. Is there any questions specifically around the Muldreth model, how that interplays with Gork, or anything that might be valuable for Rory to answer at this time? And Roy, you're very welcome to stay the whole session. I just don't want you to feel like you have to. We're almost at the end now anyway.
We're almost at the end, I guess, yeah.
Power through. But is there any questions around the Muldreth model, or how that might work with the Gork groups? We've got some ideas internally, but
I'll see if I can. I think the recordings for that are already online. I'll see if I can dig them up and put a link in.
oh, that'd be great. And Maria, I might mention it only dawned on me as you were presenting these blue slides that I have actually done a mapping between the Muldreth model and the Gork model. I did it as part of a piece of work for the World Data System, but it was within the last couple of days that I was working there and totally left my brain when I left. But that piece of work is actually still available on our Gork drive, so I'm going to email you afterwards. Don't worry about it until tomorrow, I guess, for you. But I'll email you with that piece because it's a very light level, but at least it's something that we can start with.
Well, CJ, actually, that reminds me, I was very remiss. We actually, in planning for the sessions, I was supposed to reach out to you. We wanted to get a guest commentator on the Muldreth model, and you were one of the two people that were supposed to be invited to comment. And I apologize, it just slipped my mind. So, but there's still one more session. So if we don't have to tell me now, but if you can squeeze it into your schedule, if you had time to, we'd be delighted for you to join our next session and to present that piece of work. Have a think about it.
Yeah, I'll need to look at the schedule because, of course,
Yeah.
these parallel sessions are wild and hard. But if there's no specific questions on the Muldreth model for now, because I would need to look back at that mapping now too, where it's been about a month and a half since I did it. But there are lots of avenues of possible work. And so we kind of want to open these last few minutes to anything that pops out to people or things that are not on this slide. Because so what I'm about to go through in this numbered list is everything that's on the table for the next group to work on. And the big thing is the IG will continue. The IG doesn't have a deadline. It will continue in perpetuity. Rory said it might not be there in 20 or 30 years. I don't know, man. I think if RDA is still alive in 20 or 30 years, so will the group IG. The working group, however, has a finite lifetime, and it was supposed to enter maintenance mode, but it's kind of hung on because we weren't really sure if we were going to resubmit our model as a recommendation or not. And that's still kind of up in the air. But I think what's going to happen is the International Model Working Group will actually, I don't know, arise from the ashes like a phoenix as the International Implementation Working Group, or GORC2. Very proud of my acronym there. So the avenues of possible work that'll happen now in GORC II or GORC 2 include things like the model revisions. Something that Martin was very gentle on in his presentation, but as mentioned separately, is that the wording between the different elements is the same, and that's because we had different working groups, different groups of people working on them. So we definitely need to do some wording cleanup even before we start thinking about reordering or adding in anything new. Adoption support, analysis from the speaker series, as well as any additional publications that could come out of the GORC International Model Working Group itself. There was a lot of background work that didn't make it into that report or the model, like commons types that were seen across the literature and speaker series. A speaker series analysis, so even more implementations that were actually found within the model from our speaker series, but wasn't vetted by them, so we didn't publish it, as well as cross-cutting themes that kind of lead into this discussion on the essential elements are interconnected. Mapping with relevant frameworks, which we talked about a little bit, visualizations, new model versions, so complete overhauls of the model that include this wider landscape of literature that's been published since the model was started, research hardware and physical tools and ROs. An implementation map, so not just what do you need to consider, but how do you do it? And maturity models of, so not only what do you have to do, how do you do it, but how do you do it for the specific maturity of your particular organization? So what else?
That does look like a 20-year work plan. I agree.
Yeah. Mostly to say, does anything pop out to people as more important or critical than others, or are there things that are missing that you think are really high priorities that we should include?
Please feel free to just unmute and speak, or dump something in chat if you're more comfortable with that. They want it all, CJ.
Yeah, I'll say maybe what I think is most important, and hopefully that gets people thinking too, because Rory and Andrew, Andrew's a co-chair and Rory is a very integral part of the GORC working group. That I'm interested in your feedback too on what you think is most important. I think things like the model revisions and adoption support and feedback are low-hanging fruit that we can do relatively easy, especially revisions around like rewording and cleaning up the items organization or statements. And for mapping relevant frameworks is something we've already started and is obviously a key interest for a lot of people. 5 is going to be harder. I think maybe we can lean on RDA Tiger for that kind of support, or apply to RDA Tiger for that kind of support now that the model is actually endorsed. So yeah, I'm kind of thinking 1 and 2 are already, could be low-hanging fruit or already underway, and then 4 and 5 are maybe where we want to focus more of our attention in the short term. I'm just scared of making a new model. I'm not going to lie. Number 6 is terrifying.
Yeah, number 6 is terrifying if it's a whole new thing, but if it's a tweak to the existing one, it's less scary.
Andrew, do you have a different view on the items that we might want to tackle sooner rather than later, or as like a first step for our GORC 2?
So I think 1 and 2 are the obvious ones. I think it's a kind of a 6-month cleanup, going back and looking at it again with fresh eyes. I think that would be very, very helpful. And clearly, if we want to make it easier for people to adopt, we need to provide better adoption support. So I agree with you that 1 and 2. I guess for me, the other ones that I'd be interested in looking at would be 7 and 8. How do you implement? And how might you assess different maturity levels? I'm still struggling with an alternative to maturity levels. But how do you balance where your organization is with where it wants to be on each of those dimensions? But they're both significant pieces of work. I mean, honestly, I could imagine spinning up a working group for most of those. Okay, thanks, Andrea. Thanks for joining us. I can imagine spinning up a working group for each of these. So it's, yeah. I think maybe if we regroup after we've done the repeat session and see if there's some kind of consensus. If people have particular things that they would like us to focus on, please just dump something in the collaborative notes just to let us know, or join the group. We have regular meetings, and you can provide input there.
Yeah, and before maybe I share the last slide on next step, Rory, does anything pop out to you?
Yeah, I guess I think 1 and 2 are. I mean, the only thing that pops out to me is there's too much for any group to do. So I agree with that. Better to try to focus and choose two or 3 things and focus on them, and keep the others in mind on the back burner, etc. I guess the mapping with relevant frameworks. Well, I mean, obviously that's a significant in terms of Maldrith. I think that's a kind of a separate discussion of how we can, if we have a separate working group, then it would almost be like a joint venture or something along those lines, or a collaborative effort. But that would provide more resource as well, because it would be another group. So it wouldn't be one group trying to do that as well. So that's something we can continue to discuss.
Yeah. And I kind of like your point around, you kind of need to choose like 1 or 2, like maybe 2 or 3 things and kind of commit to it. And for those that maybe haven't worked in a RDA working group before, typically you have between 2 and 3 deliverables. Most of the time you'll deliver on 2. And so that kind of lines up. And so we do have a lot of work that we could do, but the other thing to keep in mind is, so model revisions, adoption support, mapping relevant frameworks, and visualization and graphics, those are different levels of work too. Like the mapping is a lot more of the conceptual work that we kind of tend to do in RDA, whereas the visualization and graphics are things that we might be able to get support for through RDA Tiger or other technical folks. So that might not be things that the working group itself actively does, but more so reviews. So that kind of makes sense to me. And we do have other groups that are looking at doing things like implementation maps through profiling of the model. So those are things that could trickle down from our profiling of the model into a working group later on. So I think that's an interesting point. All right, just in the last minute or 2. So Gork 2 is being finalized. We're probably not going to launch it until the RDA website is stable. Yeah. We're going to stick with our Gork interest group and Gork international model working group pages for now. We'll be sending out updates and things through those mailing lists. So please join one or both, preferably both, so that you don't miss an update. We do have a Birds of a Feather for Health Data Commons Gork profiling. You'll see that on Tuesday, May 22nd as well. And we are looking for co-chairs, but specifically from the Global South, because right now all of our co-chairs are from the Global North. And we want to make sure that if we're talking about a global open research commons, that there is in fact global representation. So feel free to reach out to me, Andrew, and our other co-chair, Javier, if you're interested, and we can help walk you through that process of where we are with it, because that's a slow process too. Andrew, any other words of wisdom?
No, never.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for coming to this session. I hope it was useful for you. And thank you, Rory, so much for coming and presenting despite the poor time zone where you are.
A pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right, so I'm going to stop my share. All the links are in the collaborative notes, so you can find the slides and
stops
all
the
the links in there
recording?
too. So the recording is, we've been told to just leave the session and that'll stop it. But I'm
Okay.
assuming we can also just press stop if we really wanted to.
Well,
Hey, night,
okay,
everyone.
see you, Rory.
Take care. Yeah.
Good night,
Bye-bye.
Rory.
So I'm wondering, CJ, whether you wanted, if you can stop the recording, do you just want to stay on for a few minutes just to do a quick kind of debrief?
I would like to do that. But because I'm a little anxious around canceling the recording overall, how about we meet on a separate Zoom link,
Okay, I'll send you a, do you want me to email you a link?
if that's okay?
Yep, sure. I'll do that now.
Thanks, Andrew.
Okay, see you in a minute.